the city and Iraq as a country need stability. Now, Donald Trump gave himself 30 days to come up with a plan to soundly and quickly defeat IS. Is there such a plan to be found? Tonight, he appointed a new national security advisor. That's a week after losing his last one. General HR McMaster is the new one. Let's briefly talk to Mark Urban, our diplomatic editor. Mark, General McMaster, tell us about him.
Evan, it's almost as if the workings of the Washington machine and fate are acting to wall in the Trump White House with sober, sensible people. General McMaster is highly respected. As a major, wrote a book critiquing the failures of civil and military leadership getting the country into the Vietnam War, so he knows all about the business of high-level command. In Iraq, at a time when there was no good news, commanded a very complex battle in a place called Tal Afar, very near Mosul, in fact. Complex battle, brought it off successfully. That brought him to the attention of General Petraeus, who pushed him through his promotion board to Brigadier General. Up until then, the army had been rejected him. Spent some time in London as well at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. A very thoughtful, experienced man in the business of the complexities of modern operations.
And how difficult was it for President Trump to fill this post?
Well, shockingly so in a way. You'd think there would have been any manner of sharp-elbowed Washington operatives wanting to get in there. But of course, after the circumstances of General Flynn's departure, there were a couple of people who the job seems to have been offered to, but who didn't actually take it for various reasons. Mainly, it seems, because they weren't being given the right to hire and fire their own staff in its entirety. And then, of course, the choice settled on McMaster, who, as a serving officer, could not refuse, unlike the first couple of people who'd been tapped up. So duty calls, he's been pushed forward, and there are so many things in his plate, starting with this business you were referring to, 30 days to come up with a new plan. There still isn't one. When will there be some sort of plan? Mosul has been a battle in two halves, and Iraqi forces have now launched the second phase. As they push around the city, an anxious population remains within.
We're very worried that in the days and the weeks ahead, as the military campaign intensifies, that families are going to be at extreme risk. Already, there's a humanitarian crisis in the western districts. The prices of food are skyrocketing, fuel is scarce, water has been cut, electricity is intermittent. We understand that half of all the bakeries are already closed. The poorest families are forced to sell their furniture, burn their furniture in order to heat their houses.
The Mosul offensive began 4 months ago, initially with a push to take the north and east of the city. By the beginning of this month, they'd cleared almost all of it up to the Tigris. This week's attack aims to envelop the west of Mosul prior to clearing that. But while Mosul's fate now looks sealed, ISIS still has its Syrian power base of Raqqa. There's an American-backed militia to the north and Syrian government forces to the west. But ramping up the US effort is fraught with political difficulties.
The key question that this administration is going to have to determine is how quickly do they want to get to Raqqa? If they want to move on Raqqa within the next 4 to 5 months, and they want to do that working by, with, and through local forces, they're likely going to have to provide more assistance, either in terms of equipment and training or in terms of direct U.S. And coalition military combat support to the Kurds, who are best positioned to isolate and then seize Raqqa with their Arab partners on the ground.
It's very simple.
During his campaign, Donald Trump promised to put a swift end to the so-called Islamic State.
Immediately after taking office, I will ask my generals to present to me a plan within 30 days to defeat and destroy ISIS.
But now, 30 days after the inauguration, there's little sign of a crushing new American effort. Rather, the existing Mosul plan put in place under Obama is coming to fruition, and the US Defense Secretary visiting Iraq was giving little away when asked whether additional American troops would soon be dispatched.
We'll accommodate any request from the field commanders. Right now, our allies are carrying, as you can tell from the casualty lists, the overwhelming burden of this fight in their own territory. And we'll work by, with, and through allies from the coalition. And that coalition, as you know, has got more than 60 nations at varying levels. So we owe some degree of confidentiality on exactly how we're going to do that and the sequencing of that fight.
General?
Mr. President, thank you very much. I'd just like to say what a privilege it is to be able to continue serving our nation.
While the Pentagon has prepared some options for President Trump, the White House national security machinery has stalled and awaits the new leadership announced tonight.
You're going to do a great job.
What does strategic planning look like in this administration? The good news is that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is still in place, Secretary Mattis is in place, Secretary Tillerson, and most of the military leadership is still there. So I know the president's going to get options. How those options are then vetted by the White House is the real mystery to me.
At the moment, America's ground force in Syria consists of these lightly armed, mainly Kurdish militias and a couple of hundred special forces. Giving them heavy weapons or more direct US support are options now on the table. The Trump administration faces the same constraints that the Obama one did. Sustaining or increasing airstrikes requires access via Turkey, but increasing pressure on the ground through allied Kurdish militias would annoy Turkey and jeopardize that access. How to resolve it if you put more American troops on the ground in Syria, that too might antagonize Turkey, Syria and the Russians. It's a conundrum. So for now, the US options appear to involve more of the same, but if there is to be a radical departure, it could be up to America's new national security advisor to come up with it.
Mark Urban there. Well, John Feiner was Chief of Staff to Secretary of State John Kerry in the last administration and Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, leaving last month. He joins us from Washington. Very good evening to you. Can you first give us your impression of General McMaster? Is that a good appointment?
By all accounts, it is a good appointment, and I would certainly agree. You know, before I worked in government, I was a reporter for the Washington Post and spent the better part of a couple years in Iraq covering the war there. I actually spent about a month living and working alongside General McMaster in Tel Afar, which was one of the seminal battles of the Iraq War that he was the commander of. And he really proved to be an innovative commander, trying some of the sort of new counterinsurgency tactics that then were applied later in the conflict during the period of the surge and started to turn the war more in the direction of U.S. and coalition forces.
Right. Do you think, and a lot of people have said it's rather chaotic and we haven't had clear policy in all sorts of areas, do you think now Flynn is out of the way, that's all, that controversy is out of the way, do you think stability and, if you like, clear policy will now emanate from this White House?
Well, I think it's going to be a lot harder, frankly, than replacing one person, as important a job as the National Security Advisor is. This is an encouraging pick, but the real challenge has been, so far, President Trump has not been inclined to actually empower the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council, and has actually established, or allowed to be established, a parallel policymaking process run by Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and some others that is doing some of the serious strategic thinking about national security issues that used to be done and historically has been done and frankly should be done by the NSC. So I think the real question and the real challenge that General McMaster will have, he will have a mastery of the issues. He will perfectly well understand especially this biggest, most important battlefield in which U.S. forces are engaged in Mosul and in Iraq and Syria. The question is, does he have the trust of and the relationship with the president such that he will be empowered to make policy?
Right. Now, one interesting thing is, and you heard it in Mark's piece there, the president said within 30 days, I want a plan, and I think the words at one point he used were to wipe ISIS off the face of the earth. Now, is there a plan to be found that will achieve that?
Well, look, I think where the president should start, and where I think the Pentagon will start, is with the plan that's already in place. There has been extraordinary progress made already in the fight against ISIS. They had seized control of broad swaths of territory in Anbar province, predominantly Sunni province. The Iraqi army, with our help, has gone in and pushed ISIS out of those major cities, places like Fallujah and Ramadi. Now we have turned our attention to Mosul, which we always knew would be the hardest of the fights in Iraq, and half the city at this point has been liberated. Now, that took 4 months, and that is the less populous half of the city, and by all accounts, ISIS is very well dug in the other half of the city, in the western half that is still occupied. So this is still going to be a very difficult fight. Moving this more quickly is going to require a greater investment of U.S. forces, and that will also potentially produce more casualties. So the question is will this White House decide that it wants to get more invested, or will it be comfortable with the pace as things proceed, which right now has been relatively successfully over recent months?
Right. But when you take the battle against ISIS into Syria, there is a conundrum. You can either have the ground war, which means offending the Turks, or you can have the air power via Turkey, which leaves you helpless on the ground, or you send your own guys in and you potentially upset quite a lot of people. Is there a solution to that? I mean, do you think President Trump can stand up and say, look, I've got an idea. It's not what Obama was doing. It's not this slow progress that we were already making. I've got my own idea, and it's going to get quick results.
So you're right, and you've hit on one of the central problems of the fight against ISIS. We have an advantage in Iraq that, frankly, we don't have in Syria, which is that we have a local partner, the Iraqi army, that we have a good relationship with, that we've trained, that we've equipped, and that knows how to fight, not always displaying it as effectively as it should have several years ago when ISIS pushed it out of some of these cities, but which has stood itself back up and is now taking the fight to ISIS. In Syria, we do not have that ready partner, which is why this very difficult decision about whether we will use Kurdish forces to effectively fight in what is predominantly Sunni Arab territory is going to be the hardest one in many ways that the administration will face. That will come at a cost in terms of relations with the Sunnis who are doing who are living in those areas. But at this point, there is no other obvious fighting force for which to take cities like Raqqa. John Finer, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Major General Chapman was senior British military advisor to US Central Command. That was in 2010 to 2013. He worked under General Mattis, who is now Donald Trump's Defense Secretary. Good evening to you. Do you know of a plan that is radically different to the plan we heard John Finer describe, which is the Obama plan? Is there a plan sitting there waiting to be hit upon that is going to wipe ISIS off the face of the earth quickly?
Well, you have to separate it into two parts here. Firstly, the president's missive that you should come up with a plan to defeat ISIS in 30 days is not credible in the sense that defeat is a military mission verb, and it won't lead to the religious, ethnic, sectarian, tribal and ideological tensions being put to bed. So this is partly to do with governance and partly to do with stabilisation. If you were to say, do CENTCOM, the higher headquarters which really run the Middle East, have plans? Of course, they have lots of plans, and it's CENTCOM's job to give the president options from a left of arc of humanitarian support to a right of arc of putting 60,000 people, the 82nd Airborne over, dropping in, and the Marines over a beach. But will the American people go for that? I don't think so. So the military part is simple. The stabilisation and governance part is the real challenge.
Right. Give us some insight into General Mattis, the Defense Secretary. People speak very highly of him. They call him Mad Dog Mattis. I mean, he has all names like that. Give us some insight into him and what approach you think he will take to this.
Well, actually, Mattis is a very thoughtful and wise person. The Mad Dog is an acronym, is a sort of military, it's a media meme. It's a sort of packet of cultural information put out there from when he was a warfighter. Actually, in his latter career in CENTCOM, he was a warrior diplomat. Indeed, if you look at his confirmation hearing in the Senate, he said he looked forward to working with all the other organisations of government, including state, because of course you have to look wider than just the military part. So he's looking at grand strategy. That's where he will look in terms of diplomatic, information, military and economic power, not just in a short, very narrow military context.
How like Donald Trump is he? How close in thinking do you think he is to the president? Is he a Trumper?
He never made any political pronouncements during the campaign, and neither would he. He is a servant leader who I think took the job because he is there to serve America. That's where his heart is and always has been in his 40 years of military service.
One of the things that obviously Trump is associated with is having a much closer relationship to Russia in Syria. Now you can imagine that there are some old school Americans who are like, hang on a minute, the Russians are not our allies, forget it. Which side would Mattis be on that?
Mattis is an internationalist, and he said on many occasions when I was with him that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is not fighting with allies. So he is an internationalist, he's a supporter of NATO, and he's not really very pro-Russian at all. He will look at this again through a grand strategic lens of where Russia are threats, because of course his job is now wider than the Middle East. It's Russia, it's China, it's a global forum, and he's one of the most well-read men you can come across. So he's a great strategic thinker.
But it takes more than the great strategic thinker to solve the Mark Urban conundrum that every time you try and do something, you put your troops here, or you use this air power, or you use this ground power.
Yep.
You're offending another player in the region who you're relying on for supplying your troops or for flying them in or whatever. Is there a solution to this? I mean, is there a way out?
Well, I'll give you two Mattis quotes here. The first thing is Mattis always said, this is a wicked problem. And sometimes, and he quoted Winston Churchill here, you can have too much war. And a direct quote from him on Syria was this: I am morally appalled as a soldier, outraged, but there is a pragmatic side to strategy. Do you want soldiers in a Muslim country shooting people? No, you need an international mandate. You have that international mandate in Iraq under UNSCR 2249. You do not have that in Syria. But to unlock IS, you need to be successful in both Iraq and Syria.
Right. Well, you put it very well. Chip Chapman, thanks very much indeed. Thanks.